Hi, I'm Greg Hall, and I'm going to go over revisions made to the PSPE comments reveal system and an enhancement made to the patient case bank system. So without further ado, let me click on our OEIS website. It's going to bring up our login screen. I'm going to log in with my user ID and password. So under the PSPE header, I'm going to click on PSPE comments. Notice we no longer have the ID here, so our primary key is the EIM number. So let me show you the structures. So this is our primary key, PS_ID, which is the EIM number. Notice it's no longer auto increment because we will not be adding records in our website. The data is coming from our OEIS server from Stephen and Neha. They'll be bringing in the data via SSIS or link server, so we will not be adding records to the website. It's coming from the OEIS server. And we have two additional fields. We have last modified date and last modified user. Let me show you how that looks like in our grid. So if I scroll to the very right, you'll see last modified date and last modified by. So when we first start this off, the data is coming from the OEIS server from Stephen and Neha, so it's system generated. So what Stephen and Neha are going to have to do is populate the last modified user field with system for this to work. And let me give you an example of how this works. If I, for example, edit this first record with my user ID, I'll just put an exclamation mark and I'll click on Save Changes. Notice it tells me when the record was last modified and who modified it. It has my name and user ID. Also notice we no longer have delete buttons in here because in our business rules we will not be deleting records in our PSPE comments web interface. And you'll no longer see the deletion here. We used to have an editing submenu where you can edit and delete. Now we just have editing here. Because again, we're not deleting records in this system here, in the PSPE comment reveal system. One big change we made here was on the drop down in the reveal status. So now we have an additional field here called blank. So what does that mean? So for example, if I was to select exclude here and click save changes, I may say, maybe I don't want exclude, so I can blank this out. I can just click on blank, click save changes, and now it's blanked out. So you cannot type in text in the reveal status. You have to select it from the drop down for integrity reasons. Because for example, you don't want to misspell something here, right? You don't want to misspell one of these reveal status. So what else is new? Okay, so let's look at this guy. Let's go to edit, and let me just show you how it looks in this view form format or form view format. You'll now see a blank here in the radio button, and let me scroll down a bit. They'll see last modified date and last modified user, user ID and name. And let's go to view data. Let's do it from here. So this is read only. This is viewing data. Last modified date. And we have last modified user here. And also in our email too. I also had to add the fields here. So these are all the populated fields for this specific record. I have last modified date, last modified user ID, and last modified user name. So I think that's all I had to do as far as revisions. Let's see, report. Didn't have to do anything here because we don't have the ID or primary key. One thing I did do here. So this is, I had to debug this. So let me show you attachments. So for attachments, if we create a new attachment, So before, if I accidentally, inadvertently clicked on create, it would throw an exception. Now I debug this, so now it'll give me a message here, must choose a file. Because when you create a new file or a new attachment, you're supposed to click on choose file, or you're not supposed to click on this first. So before you can accidentally click here, if you accidentally click here, it would throw an exception. So now it gives you this message here, must choose a file. And you can click OK and then choose your file. You can click here to select your file. And I debugged this, made this change not only with the PSPE Comments Reveal system, but also with the patient case bank system and the task system as well. So I think I finished everything here as far as revisions and changes made here. So now let's go to the enhancement. To me, this was a big breakthrough with the patient case bank system. Let's go back home. So now we were able to have the lead buttons in the grid for the 3 ways of looking at patient case records. So we can select by categories, we can have grid with comments only, and grids with all fields. Let me just click here to show you what I mean. So before, we didn't have the delete buttons, and that's because we had to take into consideration attachments. So when you delete a record or multiple records, you have to take into consideration the files, and you need to delete the files associated to that record unless that file is in another record or other records. So before, we had to go to the file menu, go to editing, and click on delete every time you wanted to delete a record. I mean, in this case, for the patient case bank system, you're probably not going to have to delete records very often. But for future applications, if you wanted to, you might have some, I don't know, a task system, or every week or month you might want to go through your grid and say, I want to delete this, as opposed to going to your file menu and going to delete. It's just a lot easier to visually see things, all your records in a spreadsheet format or a grid format, and let's go delete. You still have to have, if you click on delete, it's going to ask for confirmation. I'll cancel this. But if you only click on save changes once, so you can delete, it's going to ask for confirmation, delete, and then click save changes. So this is a breakthrough. So for future applications, I can see this being really very useful. And what I did too was I created documentation for this too. So yeah, it's important for me to have this documentation, because a week from now I'm just going to forget what I did, and it's easy if I can just see this, I can just look through this. Actually, it's pretty easy. Once you understand how the behavior of the grid, then I was able to do this. It just took a little bit of time to understand how the grid worked with batch editing. Just like the store procedure I created for drag and drop sorting, you have to understand the behavior of the grid before I was able to write that drag and drop sorting store procedure. So here, what I did, let me just show you this at a very high level really quickly. So here, we delete records at the controller level. The controller is your brain in MVC. And you can see here, this is where we can delete a file. So when you see something like underscore dashboard and then delete file, that means it's calling a SQL statement or a stored procedure. You'll see a lot of that here, because I need to get information, right? I need to query SQL to get information, like the IDs and file names, in order to know what to delete, which files to delete. I probably could have done this via SQL using a shell, but I think it's better to do it using the controller, doing it on the controller, which is the brains, where you can actually see everything. And yeah, I think it's easier to maintain this way. So yeah, let me just show you what's done. At a high level, I'll just talk about it. So all you're really doing is getting the IDs, all the IDs that where you selected all these guys to delete. You're getting the IDs, and you have to make sure, you have to query to make sure you're only getting the IDs that have a file or files, right? You don't need to get an ID that doesn't have a file when you're deleting that record. I mean, deleting that file. So you get all the IDs, and then in SQL Server you can write a query to delimit those IDs. And in this case, I delimited it by semicolons, and that's because you need to go through a for loop. You need to go through each of the characters. You need to get each ID. So basically, for loop is going through each of the characters. If it's not a semicolon, it's just concatenating each character here, each of the ID characters into a variable. But if it does, if it's a semicolon, that means it's finished. That means we have our ID here, our whole IDs in our variable from concatenating all the characters. And then all we have to do is, you have to get the information. You have to query to get all the files via query by the ID to get all the files associated to that ID. So there's like one many relationship ID in all the files. And then you do pretty much the same thing. You can get the files, a string of files, and then it's delimited by semicolons, and you can go through another for loop, a second for loop, and just get the, if it doesn't see the semicolon, it's just going through each character and just concatenating it into a variable. Once it sees the semicolon, you got the whole file name. And then from the file name, you have to write a query to get the count to see if that file is in any other record or records. And for example, here it just does the count. It queries off SQL Server. It says if the count is less than 2, meaning that there's only one file, go ahead and delete it. But if it's in if that file is in another record or other records, then don't delete it. That's pretty much it. And then once it's finished with that, then delete that record. Delete those records that you selected. Delete the records. So that's pretty much it. So it's just basically you're just getting the IDs. Once you get the IDs, you have to go to each ID and then get the file names for that ID. And then from the file names, you have to just check if it's in other records. If it's not in any other record, then go ahead and delete it. So that's pretty much it. That's pretty much the gist of this algorithm. So yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to cover here. So I hope this makes sense. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.